Production of Steamboats, the Fall Rive Line, was made possible by grants from the Steamship Historical Society of America, by NETA, the National Educational Telecommunications Association, and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and the financial support of viewers like you.
They were the grandest means of travel for their time, the height of service, safety, and style. Floating palaces that not only transported passengers to their destinations, but also carried them into a world of elegance. For nearly 130 years, these grand steamboats plied the waters of Long Island Sound, their parting whistles a piece of the everyday routine in towns with names like Fall River, Newport, Providence, Stonington. Now they're all gone, vanished along with an entire age of steam, leaving only images and memories.
There were many lines between New York and Boston. You could go to Boston from New York by steamer to New London, take a train to Providence, New Bedford even, or someone to Hartford. And in later years, there was even a direct line from New York to Boston. The Fall Rive Line, for some reason, had the reputation of being the standard route by steamer between New York and New England.
They were just, I really don't know how to explain it, except that it was just thrilling and beautiful, and you'd never find anything like that again, I don't think.
It was the woodworking and the finishings on the wall that were done so magnificently.
Well, I'll tell you, I felt kind of special because my grandfather was the captain. Let's face it, you know, I mean, they, even the passengers, they were all made welcome and everything.
My first recollection is 1929 when my sister was just a baby. My mother carried her in a basket, and we took the train, the ferry, and the boat up to Fall River.
Whether you called it the boat, the New York boat, or one of the constantly changing official titles, the premier steamboat line in America was known to most people as simply the Fall Rive Line. For 90 years, the Fall Rive Line ran stately white steamers up and down Long Island Sound as part of a luxurious rail boat link between Boston and New York.
Just stepping aboard a Fall Rive Line steamer into the quarterdeck, you found yourself in extraordinarily elegant, peaceful, away from railroads and automobiles and trucks delivering freight and so forth. It was elegant and quiet, and you were being waited on, and that was fun.
Ed Dunbaugh is a historian and author. He's part of a select group who can still recall firsthand what travel on a Long Island steamer was like. Muriel Bailey remembers too. In the 1930s, her family took several boat trips to New York.
Anyway, and of course, every time I went, well, we'd go in, my father and I would go in the pilot house, and my grandfather would let me help him blow the whistle and like that, you know, and it was real interesting.
It was over 60 years ago that Johnny Pena was bellhop and steward for the Fall Rive Line.
I would stay there in Boston all day until about 5 o'clock, and we leave the South Station, in which I would give out the stateroom keys that the passengers had bought in Boston.
A passenger could buy his ticket in the depot in Boston, or he could get it from the conductor. And when he got on board the train, the conductor would have the keys. And if you had a reservation for room 15, well, he gave you the key, and you would give him the ticket.
Train went right into the Fall Rive Line dock, where there would be a whole line of porters waiting for you.
That train used to come in there and rumble down that dock, way down there, and you'd hear the wheels hitting.
The train would go into Fall River and back right down the dock. The passengers could get right off and walk maybe 20 feet to the gangplank.
It started off with just a maze of activity down there at the dock of Fall River, where there were people walking around, running to get onto the boat, and I mean a great many people.
Our duty was to make sure everyone entering the boat had a ticket, and if they didn't, we sold it from our office, and we had staterooms and tickets, and we could sleep 1,500 people in staterooms on the Commonwealth.
The Fall River Line's reputation was built on three things: service, safety, and elegance. It was a style of travel we can only imagine today. Much of the service depended on the large staff of the steward's department. And this was an age of both ethnic and racial division. All of the waitstaff was black.
At this point, one cannot ignore the fact that the Long Island Sound steamer lines were segregated. And the stewards were one racial group and everybody else was another racial group. We are ashamed of that now, but that's the way it ran. We might as well mention it.
Julian Youngblood was a young man then. His job as a kitchen pantryman and porter gave him a chance to see the world for the first time. Working for the line was often a family affair, and Youngblood learned from his father, who was head hallman on the same boat.
I saw my father take and run, and he ran up because he, you know, when you're catching bags for money, you run. And I saw him take and run, and I heard some of the porters say, you see, that's the way you have to make money.
The way they had it with the porters are, each one had so many rooms to make up. And then they made their money by smashing baggage from the train to the boat, or from the boat to the train, and waiting on, you know, that's how they really made their money. Like today it sounds funny because it was only nickel and dime tips then. But nickel and dimes added up in those days because, like I said, I worked all week, 12 hours a night, 7 days a week for $14.99.
I learned my lesson. One day, this family asked, say, porter, can I have a porter? I said, yes. I looked at them. I grabbed the bags. I walked on. They got the key, and the key was on outside stateroom up on the gallery deck forward. So I went up there, and I gave him, I said, thank you very much, and I went out the door. The lady says, wait a minute, porter, and she handed me $1. And she said, can you get us some ice water? You know, I went after that ice water. I didn't care what anybody else said, and I learned a lesson. You wait on everybody the same way. You never know.
The focal point of all the Fall River Line boats was the Grand Saloon, an ornately decorated hall that was the centerpiece of steamboat design from the 1860s on.
It was quite impressive, I'll put it that way. And the walls, or bulkheads, if you want to call them that, were lined with nicely upholstered plush chairs, fit for a king and a queen.
You walked into a giant room. I've forgotten just exactly what they called salon, I guess, and it was all of carved wood in these great big staircases.
The multi-level design was an innovation that came to Long Island Sound with the steamers Bristol and Providence in 1867. Nicknamed Peacock Alley, the Grand Saloon was a lounge, a meeting place, a place to see and to be seen. Looking back at the early photos gives at least some hint of the vastness of steamboat interiors. The saloon of the steamer Bristol, the interior of the steamer Puritan, and that of the largest Fall River steamer, Commonwealth. Flat still photographs do not do justice to the scale of these enormous rooms, but through computer animation, we can recreate some sense of how large the boats and their interior spaces actually were. This recreation of the saloon of Priscilla shows how the boat's grand staircase dominated the room. An elegant electrolier high in the ceiling highlights the 125-foot-long space. Seeing the rich paneling, the ironwork on the gallery railing, the great depth of the room, one begins to feel just how grand a space this must have been.
Watching the steamer pull out, this enormous vehicle pulling away from us, and to feel the air in your face coming down Mount Hope Bay, and the steamer usually stopped at Newport.
From there, they would come down between Prudence and the island of Rhode Island. And
Luther Blount is president of the American-Canadian Caribbean Line of Warren, Rhode Island. We're aboard one of his small cruise ships today, following the exact route the Fall River Line steamers took on their nightly trip to New York. Following their on-time 7:30 p.m. departure from Fall River, the steamers would take about an hour to make their way down Narragansett Bay to Newport, Rhode Island.
They pulled into Newport, took what passengers they had to pick up and what freight, then they backed out and went around the south end of Goat Island, between Goat Island and Fort Adams.
We'd go past Fort Adams and on out past Castle Hill. You'd start to feel the ship, as big as it is, would lift up and kind of tip a little. And then it would go down and the back end would come, and the front would go up again, and then a wave would lift it high. And
Point Judith to Fisher's Island was the open ocean part of the voyage. It was here that the boats encountered the roughest water, heaviest seas, and rockiest sailing.
The area from Point Judith to Watch Hill, when you go through the race, is out in the open ocean. Not only that, but as we said before, subject to all kinds of tides. I've taken ships past Point Judith many times. It was sheer delight. I've also taken trips around Point Judith that I will never forget. I am sure my fingerprints and those of many other people can be found in every railing on the ship. You didn't believe that a ship with a wooden superstructure could survive, while every time the ship rolled, the guards hit the water on one side and hit the water on the other, and then the ship would rise 10 to 15 feet in the air. It was a rough trip. It could be a very rough trip.
And it's slow because it's big, you know. And you get it up, and I got seasick plenty of times. And I was awful glad. I used to say, oh, I'm glad the dining room's going to close, because I can close up the pantry and go to bed.
Throughout their history, the Fall River boats served a varied clientele. Families traveled by steamer on vacation trips or to visit relatives. Many of the line's regular passengers were businessmen traveling between New York and Boston. It was also a popular trip for newlyweds in southern New England or New York.
Fall River Line was famous for honeymooners. It was where can you get a 2-day cruise for $10 per person? And a very pleasant one with good food.
Well, on January 1st, 1937, my husband Norman and I were married in New Bedford. A friend brought us from New Bedford over to Fall River to get the boat. We left our wedding reception in order to get to Fall River. I remember going on the boat, and it seemed like it was a large, sort of a ballroom or something with fancy lights. And then we went to our stateroom, and if I recall right, we had bunk beds, which I thought was kind of strange, because I hadn't been on a boat, you know.
Many, many, many people went on their honeymoon. And they had one honeymoon suite. Most people didn't take it, but it was on the center of the boat. It was a big bedroom, you know. But most people had the usual bunks.
With so many businessmen traveling, the Fall River boats occasionally saw some less formal liaisons. As a bellhop, Johnny Pena served nearly 100 staterooms, and when something was going on, he knew about it.
A girl would come aboard the ship and say out of New York or Fall River, and I would take her bags their bags to their room, and they would say to me, Belle, if there's anything doing tonight, give them my room number, okay?
No, I mean, there's nothing to stop a man in the shoe factory in Brockton bringing his secretary aboard going to New York, and who knew what his business was, you know? No, I never heard of any such thing as that.
Now, when the men come to me and they would say, Belle, is there anything doing tonight? And I would say to them, I don't know what you're talking about. And they would put a $2 bill in my hand and say, I'm in room so-and-so.
Of course it happened. Of course it happened. It's going to happen in any crowded place, hotels and so forth. But I do know for a fact that not only the Fall River Line, but all of the Sound steamer lines and all of the overnight lines had a very specific policy of discouraging this kind of thing. If it was caught, anybody involved in it, if it was part of the crew, was immediately dismissed. If it was a passenger, the passenger was told to lay off.
Whether passengers were finding romance aboard the steamer or just traveling as a happy family group, it's easy to imagine them falling asleep to the gentle rhythms of the steam piston and the giant paddle wheels as the boats continued their nighttime passage. Past Fisher's Island, past New London, New Haven, and on down the Sound toward the eastern entrance to New York.
Securite, small passenger, Grand Carib, Farm Plant.
The entrance into the port of New York, even today, is one of the more dramatic arrivals you can make by boat.
At the head of the East River, between the East River and Long Island Sound, is an area called Hellgate, and it collects the tide coming north and south from Long Island Sound into the Atlantic. It is almost impossible to get through it. They did blast it in the 1880s, which made it possible for the lines to build somewhat larger ships, but it was always difficult.
This is what they call Hellgate right here. Where's this corner as you come around? See, now we're up on the end, the higher end of the tide. You get down through here when it's going down, you get to the max current, flood, or max ebb. You'll fly down through here. I'm just sitting here at idle right now and I'm doing 7.
This was always an exciting experience, especially for first-time travelers. It would be just before dawn as the boat sailed down the East River toward Manhattan.
The passengers, about a third of them would get up. It would be their first trip to see the shoreline and the skyline of the ships and the boats and the buildings in New York.
Yes, I did get up early because I was out on deck when the boat came down the East River.
It was getting daylight, and we could see the skyline of New York. We were quite thrilled because we'd never been before.
The trip down the lower East River at sunrise casts New York in a gentle light, with tall buildings giving off jewel-like reflections in the morning sun. And though the skyline has changed since the 1930s when the Fall River boats last ran, there are still landmarks that were visible then. The Chrysler Building, the Empire State Building, and finally, near the tip of Manhattan, the stately Brooklyn Bridge. Imagine, if you can, one of these elegant white steamers making its morning trip down the East River, gliding royally through the rush and bustle of all the other river traffic at 6 o'clock in the morning, and coming into one of the most vibrant and busiest harbors in the world.
Back in those days, an awful lot of vessels. They moved all the freight cars, remember, on car ferries. I'll never forget all the steam tugs. There were steam tugs everywhere, barges everywhere, and as well as big ships. More big ships then, of course, because they were running to Europe and everywhere.
I remember when the ship would be pulling right into the docks, and there'd be people rustling all about the place, and freight people would be there, and handlers, and taking all the cotton and everything else that came off the ship out to be transferred somewhere else.
They were standing on the on the dock, waiting for the Fall River Line boat to come in, waiting for us with limousines, taxis, obviously some important people getting off. So it was a great experience.
It was the way to go. You know, everybody, I guess it was romantic for them. They just loved to go that way. Everybody that I've ever talked to.
The ships were something to see. I mean, it's just too bad that they destroyed them, you know.
It was another era, bygone times that was so interesting. But what can you say? It's gone, and it'll never come back again.
The Fall River Line steamers are all gone now, and their passing was sudden and sad. But before these great steamboats tied up for the last time, they were a rich part of 130 years of Long Island Sound history. As we'll see, these were years filled with grandeur, competition, characters, and of accidents and even tragedy. The year 1807 was a landmark in transportation history. Robert Fulton's new steamboats had just begun regular commercial service between New York and Albany. Soon Fulton's company would look east to expand its growing empire.
It wasn't long before it became obvious that it should be on Long Island Sound, and when Elihu Bunker suggested to Fulton that they build a ship with a reasonable hull that could stand the waters of the Sound, Fulton was very skeptical because his ships were flat bottom, which wouldn't do on Long Island Sound at all. But they did. They built the Fulton and the Connecticut. They ran them from New York to New Haven, which was a one-day trip, and then a two-day coach ride. The usual way to travel between New York and Boston was by coach. And the coach travel was slow, uncomfortable. You had to share a coach with any number of people you'd never known before. You would also be posted in hotels overnight, perhaps in the same room with people you didn't know, maybe in the same bed with somebody you didn't know. It was not pleasant. It was a question of gritting your teeth till you got there.
It was no wonder then that Fulton's fast new steamboat line to New Haven was an immediate success. All the more so because of some clever political maneuvering.
They had a rule, they had gotten through the New York State Legislature a rule that nobody could run a steamboat in the state of New York except the Fulton Company, Fulton Livingston. The state of Connecticut didn't like this, so the state of Connecticut said you can't run a Fulton Livingston steamboat in the state of Connecticut. Well, every port on the north side of Long Island Sound is in Connecticut. Okay, they decided to run to Providence.
The voyage to Providence, Rhode Island was a long one, however, and partly through open ocean. So when a landmark Supreme Court decision in 1824 freed interstate commerce from interference, new steamer lines sprang up to Hartford, New London, Norwich, and later to Stonington, Connecticut.
There was a problem, however, with taking a train from Stonington or New London or Norwich. The steamer arrived there at about 2 o'clock in the morning. If you wanted to get to Boston in time for a business day, you had to get off the steamer at 2 in the morning. For most people, this isn't their favorite time of day to get dressed, have breakfast, change from a train to a boat or a boat to a train. And then you get to Boston maybe 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning, which is what they wanted.
With no clear advantage of one route over another, competition between rival ports and rival businessmen raged on quite fiercely. One of the bright young entrepreneurs who made a name for himself in these heady early days was the steamboat captain and owner Cornelius Vanderbilt. In the 1830s, Vanderbilt's prize steamer Lexington was the toast of the Sound. She would have a storied history, ending in one of the great sea tragedies of her era. More about that later. It may not have been viewed so auspiciously back then, but in 1847, several of the leaders in the thriving mill town of Fall River at the head of Narragansett Bay decided to inaugurate a rail steamboat line of their own.
Well, why not? They had a steamship line to New York and a railroad to Boston. Why not create another route, rail and steamer from Boston to New York? And as long as they were doing that, why not make it the best one? And so when they built their first two steamers, 1847 and 1848, Bay State and Empire State, they were the best. They were the fastest. they got the traffic.
Bay State and Empire State set new standards for speed and comfort. They were joined in 1854 by the smaller steamer State of Maine, which acted as a spare boat and ran in the winter when freight and passenger demands were low. Travel on these boats was a vast improvement over earlier forms of transportation, though today we would probably view it as a little primitive. For passengers unable to afford the luxury of sleeping quarters, there was space in the general cargo area where the overnight passage was spent in the company of freight and even livestock. Boat and engine technology was steadily improving in these formative years, but this was the cutting-edge technology of the time, and metallurgy and construction techniques were still catching up to the stresses of high-pressure steam. When accidents occurred, the effects could be disastrous. A boiler failure could send blasts of steam and scalding water through a ship, seriously burning crew or passengers unlucky enough to be in the way.
One of the things that they tried to do was to put the boilers on the guards. The deal was that if they put the boilers on the guards, which is the part right over the hull, on the outside, they would explode away from the passenger quarters.
This model of the Fall River steamer Newport gives some idea of how the external boilers were positioned. That Newport still carried hers on the guards in 1865 shows that the issue of boiler failure still remained a concern even at this late date. Another great concern aboard wooden steamboats, of course, was fire. Cornelius Vanderbilt had already sold his Lexington to new owners when one of the Sound's great tragedies struck.
The end of the Lexington came in January of 1840, and it was extraordinarily cold. She left New York at 4 o'clock, took her usual trip up the Sound. The passengers had their dinner, and one passenger talked about trying to walk on deck, and even though he was a sea captain and used to it, he said he couldn't take it, it was too cold. And then somebody shouted fire. Now you're out in the middle of the Sound. As soon as somebody shouted it, the pilot in the pilot house took a sharp turn to starboard to try to head for the Long Island shore, which was 5 miles away. But the rudder lines were rope. They burned. And so the Lexington went with the tide, and the tide was going northeast, which was away from land. And the ship was afire. What can you do? You're standing on a ship that's on fire. You can't jump in the water, you'd freeze to death. You can't stay on the ship, you'd burn to death. Had about 100 people on board. 4 survived.
Though the burning of the Lexington predated the founding of the Fall River Line and was certainly big news in its day, the disaster appears to have had little effect on the growth of Long Island Sound steamboating. Through its first 20 years, the Fall River Line flourished, adding the fast Metropolis in 1854. It was the largest Sound steamer to date. In order to ensure its premier position, the line constructed an even larger steamboat, Newport, in 1865, as well as a new winter boat, Old Colony. Besides new boats, this Civil War period brought other changes to the line.
The Fall River Railroad and the Fall River Steamship Line came under the domination of the Old Colony Railroad, which then extended its railroad from Fall River to Newport. And there was a period of several years during which Newport became the end terminal for the Fall River Line. It was called, in fact, the Newport Line. Don't tell anybody in Fall River that, they don't know that. This lasted from 1864 to 1869.
The move of the Fall River Line to Newport, Rhode Island had been an inauspicious one, for the year 1867 ushered in competition from 2 rival steamers, Bristol and Providence. Pride of the newly formed Narragansett Steamship Company, the twin sister ships were large and luxurious, immediately eclipsing the 2-year-old Newport. Equally grandiose were the line's 2 owners, financier Jay Gould and his flamboyant partner, Jim Fisk.
One of the interesting aspects of these ships was Jim Fisk himself. He went on board every night and pretended to guide them out into the harbor And then in grand style, the ship would come to a stop off the battery, and Fisk would climb down into a little boat and wave goodbye to the passengers. Of course, he didn't know a damn thing about it. He also had a uniform to go with it, was grander than anything. He was also the first to put uniforms on his officers, which was interesting. He copied it from the Navy with gold braid and stuff, and it became pretty much standard after that.
The battle between the two rival lines continued into 1869, when a fierce rate war broke out on the Sound. In the financial strain that resulted, something had to give.
So many of the lines were hurt by it that the Fall River, I'm not supposed to say this, but let's face it, it was the Fall River Line that sold out. Fall River Line sold out to the Narragansett Steamship Company with the condition that instead of running to Bristol, they would run to Fall River. And now Jim Fisk, we have the rather strange anomaly that the staid Fall River Line is now the president of the staid Fall River Line, with all of its New England merchants running it, is now one of New York's loudest, most bombastic financiers. This was solved quite neatly when a man who was in love with one of the women that Fisk was carrying around decided to shoot him, and then Fisk bled to death in a hotel lobby in 1872, which I'm sorry about Fisk, but it really helped the people of Fall River considerably. Gould got out of it, and very shortly thereafter, the whole line became part of the Old Colony Railroad, and again was run by staid New Englanders, which is what it should be.
The next 4 decades would be the glory years of the Fall River Line and of American steamboating in general. New boats were added to the line, the iron-hulled Pilgrim in 1883, the breakthrough Puritan in 1889, the stalwart Plymouth in 1890, and the stately Priscilla in 1894. The Fall River Line's reputation rested as much on the high standards and quality of its crews as it did on the grand steamboats. Whether working in the officer corps or in the engine room, this was seen as a prestigious job. The faces are largely anonymous now, but looking at these 100-year-old photographs, one can sense the pride and dedication these men felt. There were the captains, men like Abe Simmons, Elijah Danger Davis, and Norman Strickland, who all left a mark on the line. And dedicated officers like Chief Engineer William McCready, who served on board Priscilla for her entire 37 years of service. Even men on the crew, like deck watchman Frank DePaola, who worked the line in the late 30s, felt that they were part of a grand enterprise.
It was a wonderful job. Yeah. Yeah. I'd do it again today if I could.
Though the Fall River Line had top-notch crews and a conservative operating philosophy, accidents on the crowded Sound were a constant concern.
That they operated for 90 years with hardly any accidents at all. If you could imagine, as we said before, steering a vehicle with 1,000 people on board in the dark with no guidelines at all, these people knew what they were doing.
Stormy weather and marine traffic were some of the problems the steamers faced. The most threatening condition, however, was fog.
The only time it was bad was when it was foggy. Because I don't care what anybody says, when those foghorns are blowing, you don't know where you are or where he is.
If you've ever been on a ship in a fog, it's a very strange feeling. You're not on this earth. You don't see anything. You don't see anything except the ship you're on. And then suddenly, unexpectedly, a landmass or another vessel or a loud noise out of nowhere, and you have to be able to respond to it.
There was no radar in those days, nor any other electronic aids. The boats ran every night, year-round, So it was inevitable then that some accidents and collisions occurred. This photo of Priscilla shows her following the nighttime meeting with the steamer Powhatan. And in one of the more notorious incidents, the collision of the Fall River liner Commonwealth with the U.S. battleship New Hampshire in foggy Newport Harbor. To the embarrassment of the Navy, and as these dry dock photos reveal, the steamboat appears to have come out the better of the meeting, demonstrating how powerful and ruggedly built the Fall River steamers truly were. Except for major dry dock work, the steamship company shops in Newport, Rhode Island were the center for steamer maintenance. For many years, Richard Berry's father, Warren Berry, was the manager of shop operations.
I think he had a more fancier sounding title, like Superintendent of Marine Construction or something like that. But he ran that shop down there, told the people what to do and how to do it, when to do it. And they did a lot of good work down there. They put new boilers in the boats and did a lot of valuable repair work right there with Newport talent to help them.
Highly qualified craftsmen, many of whom worked at the great Newport mansions in the summer, found wintertime employment in the steamship shops. Newport also served as winter layover port for many of the line's vessels. The New England Steamship Company, as the line was now officially known, added 2 more boats in the early 1900s, Providence in 1905, and the enormous 456-foot Commonwealth in 1908. Commonwealth was the largest steamboat of her day and one of the largest side-wheel steamers ever built. But eventually, she would be considered oversized and a drain on the line's declining resources. Like her predecessors, however, Commonwealth was an eloquent expression of her time. As we're about to see, she marked the pinnacle of a century of steamboat design and provided a final punctuation to a luxurious, ostentatious, and more innocent era. The great era of the Fall River Line steamboats lasted for 90 years, from 1847 all the way through the mid-1930s. Yet, even though steamers ran well into the 20th century, precious little movie footage of these elegant vessels remains. This rare film clip shows Plymouth navigating the East River of New York along with other traffic of the day, including other night boats. This home movie sequence from the collection of the Marine Museum at Fall River shows the giant steamer Commonwealth dominating the spectator fleet at an America's Cup race in the 1930s. And in this film clip, we see Commonwealth again approaching the dock in Newport. In this film footage and in the still photographic record, it is easy to recognize the elegance, symmetry, and grace that marked these great steamers as more than just ordinary means of transportation. In many ways, they were moving works of art. The evolution of coastal steamboat design is an intriguing story. For most of the line's history, these boats were the state-of-the-art achievements of their day, as dramatic then as supersonic airliners are now. Throughout the history of Eastern steamboating, ship design was contemporary, progressive, exciting, and in constant flux. While the first steamboats had been fairly straightforward adaptations of sailing vessels, boats like Cornelius Vanderbilt's Lexington showed how much steamer design had changed by the 1830s. A large deckhouse now offered more spacious accommodations. The engine is enclosed, as are the boat's paddle wheels. By the late 1860s, owners were competing to provide an even greater level of luxury. The sister ships Bristol and Providence were the toast of the Sound, setting new standards for comfort and elegance.
The ships were magnificent. They were the first ones with 2 full decks and an open well between the 2. Except on the Hudson River, where you don't have heavy weather, they're the only wooden hull ships to carry 2 full decks among the main deck. With this, of course, they had to have very heavy hog frames. A hog frame is sort of a truss that holds the hull together so it doesn't either sag or buckle.
The Fall River steamer Newport, built about the same time, illustrates how the hog frame trusses imposed an obtrusive and somewhat awkward element to a steamer's otherwise graceful lines. The landmark event in Eastern steamboat design is probably best dated to 1878, with the arrival of George Pierce as the new superintendent of ships at the Old Colony Steamboat Company, as the Fall River Line was then officially known. Pierce's work would have the most profound effect on coastal steamboat design and become the standard for the era, refining the look of the coastal steamer to the elegant image we hold today.
Pierce was asked to design 2 new ships for the Fall River Line. And the first one he produced was the Pilgrim. Now, with the Pilgrim is where he introduced the concept of an iron hull. And with an iron hull, it was not necessary to have hog frames. Also, it's the first time the Fall River Line had a ship with the stacks fore and aft instead of a thwart ship.
Pilgrim, launched in 1883, was also the first American ship to utilize double hull construction with watertight compartments for improved safety. Pilgrim featured the early use of another modern invention, electricity. This was quite a novelty, as electric lighting was just beginning to catch on ashore. Pilgrim's single-cylinder steam engine was a reflection of how far mechanical design had evolved by the 1880s. The largest walking beam engine ever built, it offers an excellent illustration of the basic workings of this type of engine. The 5,300 horsepower machine was an enormous affair, and though simple, it required an engineer with a deft hand. Startup was done manually as the engineer manipulated a bar to allow steam into the cylinder, setting the piston in motion. Steam was alternately admitted through the upper and lower valves until the engine was almost up to speed. Only then did an automatic valve gear come into play and take over the admission and exhaust of steam. This was a condensing steam engine. Utilizing the vacuum created by condensing steam, the engine was able to generate around 20% more power. This power was transmitted to the massive walking beam, which stood high on the steamboat's superstructure. This in turn was connected to a rotating crank, which was fitted to the main shaft and paddle wheels. This film clip from one of the Hudson River Dayline steamers gives some idea of the walking beam's steady rhythm. All of the Fall River Line boats were powered by side paddle wheels. As illustrated here by the small bay steamer Mount Hope, paddle wheels provided quick stopping and backing power, important considerations on the busy Sound route. Thinking back to trips aboard the Sound steamers, many travelers still remember the heartbeat of these engines and their paddle wheels, sounds that made the boats seem almost alive.
That's one thing I'd forgotten. It's like a wish, 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 depending on how fast it was going.
And it was like, and that's when each paddle is hitting that water, and you'd see the splash go out.
These are sounds that have all but disappeared. The steady beat of paddle wheels turning at 22 revolutions per minute. The hiss and motion of the giant steam engine mechanism. And the haunting blast of each boat's distinctive steam whistle, a note that stuck in many a memory.
I was working down at Newport, and I heard that whistle blow, and I said to a friend of mine, I says, I must be hearing things. He says, why, what do you mean? I says, I could have swore I just heard a New York boat whistle. Oh, he said, yeah. He says, the Priscilla's whistle was on the Hamilton. And the Hamilton was a ferry boat that ran between Jamestown and Newport. And he said the Priscilla's whistle was on her. So that's how I knew it, but yeah, the sound was familiar enough with me so that I hadn't heard it in 3 years, but it came right back to me then. There was no mistaking those whistles.
George Pierce continued testing new ideas in the design of the freight boats City of Fall River and City of Brockton, before moving on to his second great passenger steamer, Puritan, launched in 1889.
The big innovation in ship design was the Puritan. Again, she has to be one of the most beautiful ships ever built. But here, Pierce introduced a style that was his own, which was copied by practically every steamship that was ever built after that, and which was exceptionally attractive. If you follow Frank Lloyd Wright, that style should follow function. Pierce didn't do that. He tried to hide function as much as possible.
Previous steamers, including Pilgrim, had enclosed the ship's large side wheels in ornately decorated paddle boxes. But a more efficient paddle wheel using feathering blades now allowed the wheels to be smaller, and Pierce took advantage of the design opportunity.
With the Puritan, he was able to hide the side wheels inside a row of fake stateroom windows, and without the paddle box, the steamer was able to have long, straight lines, which gave it a grace that the earlier ones did not have.
Six years after Puritan came the arrival of what many considered to be Pierce's crowning achievement, the elegant and graceful Priscilla.
The Priscilla's a pretty boat. Streamlined, it seems like to me. And I love that boat. That boat could go. That boat could fly.
For many people, there is something transcendent about Priscilla, a fortuitous blend of design decisions that created one of the most memorable vessels in all of steamboat history. Photos of Priscilla's interior reveal the workmanship, the attention to detail, and the elegance of her layout that captivated passengers and crew alike. All the coastal steamboats are gone now, victims of time and of the wrecking yard. But there still remains one lone survivor of this bygone age of steam. She sits in an unlikely place, a grassy hillside at the Shelburne Museum in northern Vermont, the 220-foot steamer Ticonderoga. Ticonderoga is the last surviving side-wheel steamboat in North America. And though she was only a modestly appointed lake steamer, a tour of her decks, her passenger lounges, her hallways, all offer glimpses of what steamboat travel must have been like.
Certain things that are common to all of the ships, and certainly there is apparent on the Ticonderoga as they would be on the Fall River Line. One is the rich Turkish carpets throughout. Another is the beautiful staircases. All of the steamers emphasize grand staircases. She also has the etched glass clear-story windows, which all of the Fall River Line's steamers had, so that light could come into the main saloon even though it was surrounded by staterooms.
Ticonderoga features the same type of walking beam engine found on the Fall River Line boats. Though smaller than Puritan's monster machinery, it is presented as an imposing centerpiece, just as on the Sound steamers, clearly visible through glass windows from the passenger area. With her feathering paddle wheels and hidden paddle wheel enclosure, Ticonderoga mirrors the line and form that had been perfected by George Pierce in the Fall River Line's Pilgrim and Puritan. Few full-color images of the Fall River steamers exist, especially of the boat interiors. But in these fading photographs from the Edward O. Clark collection at the Steamship Historical Society, there's another hint of the steamship decor. The dim lighting of the saloon here on the steamer Plymouth provides a visual reminder that these were indeed night boats. Here, another view of the grand saloon aboard Priscilla. The ornate light fixture in her ceiling, and one of the stateroom doors. One interesting footnote to steamer design is the fact that stateroom decor received limited attention. Here we see a somewhat glamorized view of a room aboard Commonwealth.
A small stateroom would be like my porch, just a slot with bunks on the side and one or two comfortable chairs.
It was about just a little wider than 2 feet from the door into the end, and there's 2 bunks, and my brother and I flipped for the lower bunk.
In truth, the steamer staterooms were little more than large closets with minimal facilities.
Now, if you had to go to the bathroom, then you had to get out and go down the hall a long way, as I remember.
Though the accommodations were Spartan, other aspects of a Fall River Line voyage were top-notch. Excellent food, quality service, and nightly entertainment. In the end, no one seemed to mind the cramped cabins, and most everyone came away with warm memories of their sound travel. Pierce's grand Priscilla was followed by Providence in 1905, the second Fall River Line steamer with that name, and by the giant Commonwealth in 1908. For a number of years, this was the largest steamboat in the world, 456 feet long, 95 feet wide, capable of carrying some 1,500 passengers in overnight comfort or 2,000 passengers on day excursions. Her interior was a reflection of the time, exuberant and eclectic. Where previous boats had confined themselves to a single motif, the Commonwealth had a differently styled decor in every major public room. The Grand Saloon was done in Venetian Gothic, the cafe in English Renaissance, the dining room in Louis XVI. And so it went, 7 different architectural looks in all. Like the boat itself, it was probably too much. Although Commonwealth would have her glory days in the teens and 20s, she would be old before her time, dated and oversized in a faster-moving modern world. Whether it was from the Great Depression, competition from newer and faster boats, or the dramatic growth of automobile travel, by the mid-1930s, the Fall River Line was in decline. A pair of strikes in 1937 proved the death knell of a great American institution. The line was dissolved with remarkable swiftness, and the great steamers were towed away to the demolition yards almost before anyone realized they were gone. Today, these grand steamboats live on only in people's memories, in old photographs, and in home movies. And perhaps most eloquently, in the works of marine artists like William Muller.
There's nothing quite so compelling as just the grace and the beauty and the symmetry and the artfulness, truly, of the way these ships were made. From concept to final product, there was just a total focus on creating something wonderful, something elegant, and something very functional.
It is probably the artist's brush that best captures the sentiment of this bygone era, whether in contemporary work or in the paintings from an earlier period done by artists like Fred Penzing, working under company commission. These are truly some of the most memorable images of the line. Here, one can best feel the grandeur of these great steamboats and sense the elegant style that was the hallmark of a time when traveling was an experience to be savored, not merely a tiresome inconvenience before getting there.
On the old Fall River Line, on the old Fall River Line, I fell for Susie's line of talk, and Susie deck when I met mine. I said, Sue, in your sailor suit, you look certainly cute on the old Fall River line, on the old Fall River line. I fell for Susie's line of talk, and Susie fell for mine. Then we fell in with a parson.
Production of Steamboats, the Fall River Line, was made possible by grants from the Steamship Historical Society of America, by NETA, the National Educational Telecommunications Association, and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and the financial support of viewers like you. Viewers wishing a VHS copy of Steamboats, the Fall River Line, may obtain one by calling 1-800-211-5934, or by writing to the address on your screen. Cassettes are priced at $19.95, plus $4.50 for shipping and handling.